Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be delivering the David Whitebread Memorial Lecture, particularly as a researcher with a firm focus on children's self-regulation. I'm going to talk today about a particular sliver of the work that I do around children's self-regulation, but one that I think I get asked the most about, and that is self-regulation in the context of children's digital activity, and what role does it play there? So why does digital technology seem to be particularly compelling? Why do we see the reports of the sorts of challenges that we see around children's digital engagement? I always feel like I need to start by defining what I mean by self-regulation, because there's all sorts of different conceptions of self-regulation out there. So what I mean by self-regulation, as I'll speak about it today, is children's ability to control their attention and their thinking, their emotions and their behaviors in service of their aims and goals, often despite contrary impulses or distractions that might try and lead them away. And why I'm interested in this particular conception of self-regulation is it allows young children to do a lot of really important particular things. Things like their ability to sustain their attention, to resist distraction. What do they do when things are challenging? Do they throw in the towel, or do they double down and persist in the face of that challenge? Can they endure temptations and manage frustrations? I want to give, I think, my favorite example that helps to bring this conception to life. And we were playing a memory card game, so that's what I'm going to tell you briefly about today. We had a group of 4 young 4-year-olds that we were playing a memory card game with. Just a normal memory card game. There's a bunch of cards down on the table. You flip 2. If there's a pair, you get to keep them. If not, you flip them back, and it's the next person's turn. And we had a group of 4 children. Our little gentleman on the left was able to go first. He was very excited to go first. I felt a little bit bad for him. That's the worst spot to go. You don't know what any of the cards are yet, so it's pure luck. And he flipped 2. And unlucky, it wasn't a pair. But he wasn't deterred, he kept his focus, and we moved on to the next child who flipped 2, still no pair. The third child flipped 2, still no pair. But by that point, we had seen cards where there was a pair. No one had found it, but if you were paying attention, there was a pair to be found, and we knew where it was. And you can see in our little gentleman's face that he knew that. His eyes lit up. But he waited. He waited very anxiously, but he waited. Well, our little lady on the right was also paying careful attention, and she knew where that pair was, and she went right for it and flipped those 2 cards, which was frustrating for the little boy. He was disappointed. He really wanted that pair. And his reaction when he didn't get that pair was he crossed his arms and he turned his back to the game. Now, because we're interested in self-regulation broadly conceived, we're not just interested in what is the reaction to frustration, but we were interested in what does he do after that frustration and with that frustration. So we didn't intervene. He wasn't disrupting the game. He hadn't walked away. He had just turned around and he was rightly disappointed. So we let him be disappointed and we continued on with the game. So the girl took one more turn, she didn't find a pair, and the boy decided, after about 12 seconds, of his own volition, that he was going to turn back around, a smile was back on his face, and he was ready to engage back in that game. Not only was he ready to engage back in that game, but in that time he wasn't paying attention to the game. He had remembered where there was another pair, and he went right for that one, and he got that pair. And across the game, a lot more pairs after that. So we were interested not just in how do you deal with frustration or what is that experience of frustration, but we were interested in the recovery as well. So these are some of the things that we're interested in when we're interested in children's self-regulation abilities. Now, why this particular conception amongst the many that are out there? There's a lot of reasons, and I won't bore you with all of the evidence, but I'll give you just a couple sort of snapshots of why. One is there's really compelling evidence that this conception of self-regulation as we think about it in this way, is really strongly predictive of later life outcomes. One of the studies that first turned me on to self-regulation was a study by Terry Moffat and colleagues in 2011, where they had data on children aged 3 to 8. The study wasn't on self-regulation, but they were able to create an index of self-regulation. But they also had data every year thereafter, all the way up to those children were now 32 years of age. And what they found was early childhood self-regulation was predicting outcomes decades later. And not just very nearby proximal outcomes. It predicted health, it predicted financial difficulties and wealth and employment and school completion, whether you'd encountered the criminal justice system, whether you used and abused substances. The list was long and set off this program of research, or many programs of international research, trying to understand how can we support self-regulation if it might be important for this broad set of outcomes. We know that self-regulation is increasingly emphasized in curricula, and increasingly it's a concern for families and for educators. It's one of the leading things that I think we get questions about from families. There was a recent report at the end of last year, around 7 out of every 30 minutes of classroom time is lost to disruption. And we see it regularly in public discourse. I'm going to talk about one of those areas of public discourse today. So just to say, my interest in self-regulation is quite broad. What it is, how it develops, what are the sorts of things we can do to develop it, and how there are influences across home and early childhood education and school, individual and group contexts, and in digital contexts. That's my focus today. What does self-regulation have to do with children's digital engagement, and what can we learn by the ways that it might have some role in that? But first, just to give a bit of that landscape, I feel like every week there's at least a few reports that implicate either implicitly or very explicitly children's self-regulation. A TikTok generation that can't pay attention for more than 15 seconds, or screens are ruining children's brains, or tech tantrums, or. And this is just some of them. And we've seen some of the responses that these concerns have engendered. But I wondered, what was the role for self-regulation? Self-regulation is implied, at least in this, either that children don't have enough self-regulation to deal with the demands of digital technologies in some of those media accounts, or that the digital technologies are ruining children's ability to self-regulate in some of those other accounts. But what is the story? We're sort of assuming these sort of directions of effect, and I don't know that we necessarily know that yet. So we set out to look at what the literature showed. We went broad. I want to find any study that's been done from the time children are born until the time they're 16 years of age. We're putting almost no parameters on it. It could be at any time in history, although in fairness, it's a fairly recent literature. But it could be research of any kind. It could be on TV viewing, it could be on video gaming, it could be on anything. And I had these magical visions of all of the diverse knowledge and investigations that had been done. But what we found a lot. There were more than 180 studies that we found that we wanted to reconcile, that we wanted to analyze that evidence. But they largely clustered into two things. Does self-regulation relate to screen time, how much time you spend on a screen? And sometimes they would divide that down into particular devices or particular activities, but based on time. Or is it related to problematic digital engagement? Either really high use cases or really problematic patterns of use or sort of intrusive, interrupting to life forms of digital technology use. So we meta-analyzed what we had. And here's what those results showed. In terms of time, self-regulation is only modestly related. So children with higher self-regulation only had modestly less screen time. And there's all sorts of reasons why that might be. But just to characterize, the size of effect that we found is sort of akin to the association between height and intelligence, like statistical noise, things that we discount as meaningless. But where we did find more meaningful association was problematic digital engagement. So children lower in self-regulation tended to engage in these more problematic forms of digital engagement, either at particularly high levels, problematic patterns, or risky digital behaviors, things like communicating with strangers online. So it did seem like there was some role for self-regulation, but a nuanced one. It's not simply a self-regulation is associated with how much you do it, and if you have better self-regulation, you'll do it less. But it might change the nature of the things that you do. This led us to a particular question and a particular program of research to try and figure out why this might be. What does self-regulation have to do? Why is it involved? And one of the reasons that we've spent some time exploring is related to the design of the digital products themselves. Something that is sometimes called persuasive design. So persuasive design is digital design principles that leverage psychological principles to try and persuade particular behaviors of a user in a digital platform. Some of the more questionable or misleading or manipulative versions are sometimes called deceptive design or dark patterns in some of the literature. Often in the deceptive design and dark patterns is very clearly to the benefit of the creators of the digital product rather than the users themselves. Before I go into what does design have to do with children's digital engagement and where does self-regulation come into that, I'm going to pull these threads together. But first I wanted to bring to life what exactly we're talking about. So far we're in the abstract of persuasive design. What does this actually look like? What are children experiencing? What are they being exposed to? But I also wanted to acknowledge that there is this fuzzy line between designing things that are fun and engaging. The goal isn't boring things for children to do that aren't colorful, that aren't fun, that they don't enjoy. But where is that line that tips over into persuasion and manipulation? What are we okay with? And is it as simple as there are some things we're okay with and some things we're not, or sometimes we're okay and sometimes they're not? Last night, my phone alerted me that this was a food delivery app, alerted me that there was 30% off one night only on my favorite dessert location, which I didn't do. Good self-regulation for me. I didn't do it because I was here and I'm out of the delivery radius, but still. But that same sort of thing, would we be okay if Duolingo said, hey, we haven't seen you for a while, and if you really want to learn that language, maybe you want to log back in. And so that same sort of alerting behavior, is that kind of okay now? Because it's something that I want to do and I wanted to learn, or is it still not okay? I just want to pull out it, and we can wrestle with this together as we go through this fuzzy line between designing things that are fun and engaging, and when does it tip over into persuasive or deceptive or manipulative? What are we okay with? So just to highlight that fuzzy line, what things are we okay with? What's fun and engaging? Because we don't want to just create boring experiences and activities for children, whether digital or not digital, that's not the goal. We want things that children want to engage with and can benefit from, can learn from. But where and when does that tip over into things that we're less comfortable with? And these are some of the questions that we ask. And to ask some of those questions, we need to understand what are the things that children are encountering and what are the consequences of the things that children are encountering. Just to give you a sense of how pervasive are these things in apps for young children, there are a number of different content reviews of some of the top charting apps. This is one that we led, the top 10 charting free apps and the top 10 charting paid apps. And let me pull out just a couple things that I notice in our results. First, there are some pretty prevalent types of persuasive design in apps, even for young children. So these are apps that are classified as for age 3+. Some of them are classified as within the educational section. Very common were pay to play. So the locked options that I need to give something to be able to access, particularly in the free apps. Those are the 10 on the left, the paid are the 10 on the right. We see comparatively less persuasive design there and much more in the free, but not universally so. If we looked at those disguised ads, we see quite a few disguised ads, even in the already paid apps, the ones that I paid to be able to download in the first place. But I don't want to be all doom and gloom. So I also want to point out that it seems possible to have a top charting app that has none of these persuasive design features at all. In fact, we found several of them. Just to say that even if you look beyond the top 20, Jenny Radesky's group, in their review of 160 different apps for children, found about 20% of them had no deceptive design. If we're framing it from the positive, it is positive 20%. But some other content reviews have shown even similar levels of persuasive design in teacher-approved apps versus those that didn't have a teacher-approved designation. Jenny Radesky and colleagues have also found that exposure to persuasive design tends to be higher in households with lower income. But there's some questions. There's no debate that these things are persuasive. I don't hear any arguments out there about are these things really persuasive or not. But there are questions about what does it persuade you to do? And when does it do it more, and when does it do it less or not at all? And who does it persuade? And can we learn to resist this persuasion? Have we learned to resist some of this persuasion? And then what does self-regulation have to do with all of that? Now, just to say, there's all sorts of ways that persuasive design has been proposed to have an impact on self-regulation, either by overwhelming it or trying to get around it altogether. Things like, I'm going to use things that will grab and hold your attention. I'm going to put things that you didn't expect that are going to pull your attention, and then I'm going to use the bells and whistles and sound effects to try and hold you there. Or I'm going to increase your motivation to do a particular thing that I want you to do, and I'm going to decrease any of the obstacles or barriers to you doing it. I'm going to smooth that path towards. I'm going to suggest a particular thing. I'm going to make it really easy to do. I could get you really, really excited to the point that, particularly for children, they don't have the ability yet to down-regulate that physiological reaction, which means they're more likely to engage in an impulsive or emotion-led response. Or I'm going to make you make a quick decision before slower and analytical thinking can kick in that might make you decide maybe I shouldn't do that thing. Or I'm going to use social principles, and I'm going to use that parasocial relationship to make you feel like you really want to do something because I want you to do it, or a character that you trust wants you to do it. So all sorts of mechanisms have been proposed for how it either might overwhelm self-regulation or get around it altogether. Let's work quickly before self-regulation really has an opportunity to come to bear. But what does it do? So I still have these questions about who does it persuade? What does it persuade them to do? Does it always persuade them in the same sorts of ways? And it feels like if we know this, then we can better bring our research and educational and public health apparatus to bear to say, okay, what can we do about this? How can we resist it? How can we combat it? How can we work with this? I'm going to present just a couple of our findings that start to give some answers into these things. This was one of our first studies in the area, led by Samudu Malarawachi, where we wanted to look at 3 top charting apps, as similar as we could make them. And we identified 3 apps that were top of the charts that involved playing with and caring for an animal. One of them in a content analysis was rated as low in persuasive design, not no persuasive design, but low in persuasive design. Another one in a content analysis had a moderate amount of persuasive design features, and the other one had high persuasive design. And maybe you can see particularly in the instance of high, the number of different persuasive design features that are there. And we wondered what implication there would be of playing these different apps that otherwise involved caring for and playing with a friend animal. We designed this paradigm that tried to approximate, at least in my household, some of the conditions where you're given a warning that it's time to turn off play. You get a certain amount of time, you'll get a warning when it's almost that time, and then we'll see if you can disengage, or how independently and how quickly you can disengage. So we gave children 7 minutes of playtime. You get to play with the app for 7 minutes. They're randomly assigned to get one of the 3 apps. We sat with them as they played for the first 6 minutes quietly. They got to play how they wanted to play. We were there as tech support if they wanted it, or just someone to smile along with their play if that was encouraging. But otherwise, we stayed out of it, but right near them. But at the 1 minute mark, we said, okay, in 1 more minute, I need you to turn it off, and I'd like you to meet me at the other side of the room so we can move on to the next thing. Young children aren't necessarily going to have a concept of 1 minute, so we turned a stand timer for them as well. Something that wasn't going to blare at them and alert them like an alarm, like time is up and it'll keep going until you shut it off, but something that they would need to monitor, and then when time was up, it would tell them that's been a minute and it's time to turn it off. So one of the things we wondered is, how well do they disengage from playing those apps? And how independently do they disengage from playing those apps at different levels of persuasive design? Place your bets in your mind. Sorry, I'm doing it myself now. Even at low persuasive design, they had the lowest amount of time after the time they were meant to turn it off. So after that 7 minute mark, they took an average of just over a minute longer to turn it off, but they tended to do it relatively independently. So we coded the independence as they did it entirely by themselves. For some children, they looked over at us expectantly, and we would confirm, yep, it's time, if you could turn it off, but then they would come to us. Versus after 2 minutes, we would give them a reminder, oh, look, the sand timer's up, can you come on over? And if they turned it off themselves and came over at that point, then we would code it accordingly. Or sometimes we needed to go over and do it ourselves and gently and encouragingly bring them with us to the next activity. But they tended to do it relatively independently at low persuasive design, taking on average a minute longer than we had given them. At moderate levels of persuasive design, they took another half minute longer than that. So a significant, statistically significantly longer amount of time, and with less independence. So we needed to intervene at higher rates, at moderate persuasive design, and also at high persuasive design. In fact, there was no difference between moderate or high levels of persuasive design. It seems like at moderate levels of persuasive design, there was almost this tipping point after which we needed to intervene significantly more than we did at lower levels of persuasive design. So the magnitude works out like this. If we consider children with lower self-regulation who were facing either moderate or high persuasive design, so those 2 on the left, they took 87% longer to disengage than if they had low persuasive design gameplay. They took 87% if they were playing high persuasive or moderate persuasive design compared to low. They took 98% longer than children higher in self-regulation who were also playing moderate or high persuasive design. In fact, if we look just at the children who had higher self-regulation abilities, you couldn't distinguish what level of persuasive design they were playing. They disengaged similarly, independently, and in a similar amount of time, whether it was low, moderate, or high persuasive design, which begins to implicate self-regulation as having some role here in our ability to independently disengage. So even at high persuasive design, children with higher self-regulation seemed better able to put it down. But here's the problem. We picked those 3 apps to be as comparable as we could. They were all about caring for a friendly pet, but they're different in 100 different ways. Right? The app that you saw on the left is different from the one in the middle, that's different in the one on the right, in more than just the persuasive design features that are in those apps. So can we say it's the persuasive design necessarily that caused them to play longer? So we're trying to grapple with that problem, that we don't get any say or control or input into the commercial products that are out there to be able to modify some conditions and see what those impacts are. But what we can do is we can try and build things that we can hand to heart, be comfortable with children playing with, that do allow us to modify some of those conditions so that we can understand the choices children make under different circumstances. So this is one of those that we built. It's called Giggle Scribbles, and it's a story maker app for children. So we wanted something that was creative and productive and constructive, and there was opportunity for co-use with parents and friends. So the sorts of conditions that we know are sort of more beneficial in terms of digital engagement. But importantly, what it allowed us to do is it allowed us to modify some of those design features in a safe way. So locked options, but will never take money. There might be some pop-up ads, but they're not actual things. You can't hound your parent to go and buy it for you. Right? These things don't actually lead anywhere. So the game goes like this. First, you get to pick a character. Who is it that you want to be the protagonist of your story? There's 8 different options. Those can be all unlocked, and pick what you like. It could be that some of them are locked. It could be that the main character there, Quincy, is suggesting that you pick a particular one. Sometimes there might be a pop-up limited time character that you can get. Again, no money is exchanged. You then pick a background for your story. The app merges those two, and you get some time to color them in. Color it in however you want. You can layer some stickers over top of it. And then you get to record your narration. I'm going to tell my story. It's going to capture my voice, and then I get to put a filter over it if I want to. It can sound like a chipmunk. I can make my voice sound like a robot. It can sound like a dragon. I think dragon is my favorite. And then you get to listen back to your story at the end. The app doesn't store any of this stuff because we don't want children's voices and sort of privacy and data protection. But what it allows us to do is constrain the gameplay while just modifying some of those conditions to see if children choose different things under those different conditions. I'm going to talk about some things that we haven't even published yet. I hope that's okay. Hot off the presses, we're writing it up now. This is a study where we took that Giggle Scribbles app and we situated it in a children's museum in Australia. So before coming to University of Oxford, I was at University of Wollongong, and at Wollongong they had this place called Early Start. Early Start was a massive public investment from government and university and philanthropy to create a public access children's museum with wraparound teaching spaces and research infrastructure and community engagement. So it meant we could do things like put a limited time experience on the floor of the Children's Museum. In this case, and I wish I took a better photo than when it was only partly set up. In this case, 4 nested tables, each with a holder with an iPad loaded with Giggle Scribbles on it, that children could play or not as they wanted. Or families could say no. It was just an experience on the floor so that we could ensure that children who wanted to and their parents were okay with it could play with the app or not. What children didn't necessarily know is those 4 apps were slightly different just in some of those features. They go through the exact same gameplay, but some of them had no persuasive design features. Some of them, Quincy would suggest an option. Some of them would have some locked options, and some of them, all of that stuff would be turned on. So we had a number of different conditions. And what that allowed us to do is figure out, do children make different choices when some of these things are present versus when some of these things are absent? The first job was to make sure children actually liked playing this. So we built a Story Maker app. Do children want to do this? I think so. We had 540 some odd children who chose to play across that 6 weeks. On average, they played for 10 minutes. About half of them came back in and did 1 or more stories beyond their first, so they seemed to like to return. They reported to us that they liked it, although I think they knew what we were looking forward to. So, what did we find? This is some hot off the presses. We're writing it now. Hopefully it'll be there in print for you to read sooner than later. But here's some of what we were finding. Children were actually less likely to pick an option if it was locked than it was unlocked, which I was really heartened by. Because that tells me that we can learn to resist persuasive design, and children have started to learn to resist it. Otherwise, they'd go for locked options at least as often as when it was unlocked. They don't. They tend to avoid those locked options. No one looks happy like I look. That's okay because I'm about to bring it down just half a notch. But, here's the but. But still at some point, most children went for at least one locked option. About 68% of children at some point in the game attempted it at least once. And when they did, they tended to try and get through the parental control on average twice. One child tried 26 times. So, yay! But there's still some work to do. Character persuasion, that parasocial pressure, was persuasive. This was our strongest impact, that if there was a character suggesting an option, children tended to go for that character. But context mattered too, right? They didn't do it all the time. On that first character selection screen, children tended to pick the persuaded thing at a very high rate. They were persuaded by that parasocial pressure. The persuasion on the background selection, not so much. It was still more than chance. Children still tended to pick the persuaded background more than if it weren't persuaded, but not at the same level of the character pressure. It was almost as if, at the point they picked a character, they had already started to crystallize a view of what their story was going to be about. I know who my protagonist is. I have some vision of where they live in space. Are they in Candyland? Are they in the Jurassic era? Are they in a bedroom? Are they at the beach? They had some vision for it, and they were less persuaded when they had seemingly clearer ideas about what they wanted their story to be. So, persuasive, yes, but also it kind of depends. In terms of the limited time characters, if we presented that before children got access to the 8 options, so before you get to pick, there's this limited time, do you want it? Almost half of the children went for that limited time option. But in a pop-up ad, children had learned to hit that X. Almost all of the children had exited that ad before it had finished, rather than watching it all the way through. So again, it seems like there's some things that we can do, and children have learned about resisting some aspects of persuasive design, which gives me some heart. So, I wish I had definitive answers. There's so much more work to do. But there are a couple things, actually I'm going to start here. There's a couple things that this suggests to me about ways forward. And I didn't want to end on the children get pulled by persuasive design measure. That's not hopeful. It feels a bit dreary. So I want to end with a conversation about hopeful and where to next, at least from a self-regulation perspective. I left Australia towards the end of last year, which was shortly after the social media ban came in place. It was the first in the world of its kind, although banning particular digital devices or platforms was not necessarily new. In Australia, there had been a ban on mobile phones in schools for quite some time before that, but this was the first social media ban. If you have interest, we can talk about how that's going after this session, but the thing that I wanted to talk about in the context of this particular anecdote is one of the things that we wondered about and we asked and we encouraged is, if we decide that we need to buy ourselves some time, if we are going to pursue something like a social media ban, what are we doing with the time that we're buying ourselves? So if we think about some of the self-regulation principles that we talked about, and if we bring in even more of what we understand about self-regulation, why would we expect children to get better at being able to manage these sorts of pressures of social media just because they're 16 now? What have we done in the meantime to prepare them when they age out of these bans that they are more safe, productive, and beneficial users of these technologies that they newly have access to? And this remains a question, and an important one. There's work to do here. If we're going to pull that handbrake and buy ourselves some time, what are the things we're doing in the time that we're buying ourselves to better equip children for the digital demands outside of those platforms that aren't yet banned, but also for the digital demands of their future too. And I think there's a role for larger educational programming there. We're doing some work and we've got some proposals in to try and build some of this up. How do we give children sorts of knowledge of things like persuasive design and what they're trying to do, and strategies or ways to think about it that will help them, I want to say resist, because in general we might want them to resist persuasive design, but it could well be that they want to do the persuaded thing, which is fine. So I'll prefer to say autonomous and agentic, that they get to choose. And how do we empower them with that choice? You don't have to do what that wants you to do. This is what that's trying to get you to do. Here's what I do when I see something like that. You pick what you want. Don't worry about what it wants you to do. What is the thing that you most want to do? But I think there's things that we can do, and there's emerging evidence that there's things we can do even in the everyday. Right? There's evidence coming out about limiting regulatory use of media. Increasingly pervasive is using digital technologies on long car rides or in a doctor's office or at a restaurant, the times that are going to be particularly hard for a child to self-regulate. And the digital device is going to do that work for them. I'm going to distract them from this thing that's going to be hard for them so that they don't, that there aren't any sort of disruptions or dysregulation. Which, if we think about it, also means that they never encountered that challenge and they never had to surmount that challenge. They never had to learn to surmount that challenge. Now, I'm pragmatic about it, which is why I talk about limiting regulatory use of media. But we need to have these sorts of experiences at some time to improve at the same time. There's a big trend towards selecting slower paced educational content with more predictable transitions. So slow media is one of the terms that we see now. Right now, a lot of the digital media is really quick and it cuts from one thing to the next. And you don't necessarily know what's coming next or when it's going to cut, which is kind of the opposite of what we know children learn from best or what they need, particularly at younger ages. So there's this movement towards identifying this slower media. Co-use is one of the strongest. To me, one of the most compelling umbrella reviews of this screen time literature, and we'll just wade for a minute into the screen time debate, is from Terence Sanders and colleagues, where they reviewed, they meta-analyzed all sorts of different meta-analyses on what does screen time predict. And what they found, kind of like in our meta-analysis, the associations of children's screen time with outcomes was modest, right? The less than 0.2, about the level that we found with screen time, kind of felt like statistical noise. But even for the things where there was a detrimental association, the thing that stood out to me most was those detrimental associations, if adults were doing it with children, they flipped positive. Co-use, that joint media engagement, and ideally more than just sitting with the child and watching the same thing or doing the same thing, but also having conversation about the things that you're doing. That the activity that surrounds that digital activity involves that shared interest, right? So that seems to be one of the more powerful drivers than just time. It's not to say time doesn't matter. Particularly high levels don't seem to be beneficial, but the content and context of use seem to be even more powerful predictors of benefits and detrimental outcomes. And I'll finish on the last one because I'm running short on time, but I'm happy to chat about more. It's about transitions. My biggest pressure point is when it's time to finish and transitioning a child away from the digital device towards whatever the next thing is. And there's some things that we seem to be able to do there. So I wanted to give some everyday tips there as well that seem to have some emerging evidence. So establishing shared, clear, routines around transition. Transition looks like this every time. The parameters of digital engagement looks pretty consistent, and I know what's going to happen around the time of transition. Part of that is planning for the transition. This is not a digital specific thing. If I tell my young son it's time to come for dinner and he's in the middle of reading a book, he's not going to be very happy if I say you need to stop right now because dinner's hot and you need to come. It's not fun to have to stop something in the middle that it doesn't seem to be a natural end in the same sort of way. But if we plan for that transition, other than it's time to end now, but we have some sort of even brief, fun transition activity, and sometimes something that children feed into picking, that can often ease transitions as well. Anyways, I could go on, but I don't have time to, but I'm happy to chat and take questions. Thank you all very much for your time and attention.